Good day. Yesterday, I said that Russia and the EU are engaged in a high-stakes poker game over the gas for Roubles proposal, the mechanism proposed by President Putin back in March. As of this morning, it is increasingly looking as if all the cards are starting to fall in Moscow's favor. Perhaps that's unsurprising, but that seems to be the reality. Anyway, I take this from the lead article today in the Financial Times. It reads as follows: EU energy groups prepared to meet Vladimir Putin's terms for Russian gas. And then the article goes on to say, some of Europe's largest energy companies are preparing to use a new payment system for Russian gas demanded by the Kremlin, which critics say will undercut EU sanctions, threaten the bloc's unity, and deliver billions in cash to Russia's economy. Gas distributors in Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Slovakia are planning to open ruble accounts at Gazprom Bank in Switzerland in order to satisfy a Russian requirement for payments in its own currency, according to people with knowledge of the preparations. The groups include two of the single largest importers of Russian gas, Düsseldorf-based Uniper and Vienna-based OMV. Negotiations between European buyers and Gazprom, the Russian state-controlled gas supplier, have intensified as payment deadlines approach. Italy's Eni, another of Gazprom's large gas customers, is evaluating its options, said two people familiar with the discussions. The Rome-backed company has until the end of May, when its next payment for Russian supplies is due to make a final call, Italian officials said. And then there's a great deal of discussion about whether or not this is undermines sanctions, and whether it is blackmail, which I'm going to skip over. But then the Financial Times goes on to say, Brussels has struggled to counter Moscow's demands. The Commission issued official technical guidance admitting that the financial engineering devised by the Kremlin could be sanctions compliant under some conditions. It would result in Russia being able to access billions in gas revenues to support its currency and its economy, member states and officials, EU officials said. And then it describes the mechanism. And then it goes on to say, the Financial Times goes on to say, the Commission's advisors have concluded that any move by the EU to impose sanctions against Gazprom Bank, which would be the swiftest way of closing the loophole, could jeopardize the entire existing payment mechanism for Russian gas, resulting in a catastrophic cessation of shipments to the bloc. And we go on to read elsewhere that Robert Habeck, the economics minister, said on Wednesday that the Russian payment mechanism was the path that the EU marked out for us. It's the path that is compatible with sanctions, and as far as I understand, the German companies that are doing it this way are in compliance with their contracts. Most EU countries are taking this approach. I fully expect any to follow where the Germans, the Austrians, the Slovaks and the others, the Hungarians, have led. And that will leave a small group of states, Poland, the Baltic states and Finland, which has a government which is taking some very strange decisions, in my opinion, decisions which I suspect will one day haunt Finland. Anyway, those countries increasingly look as if they're going to be out on a limb. And by the way, I'm getting some reports, which I cannot confirm, that there are already gas shortages in parts of Poland after the Polish government refused to pay to meet the Russian demands and to adhere to the payment mechanism that the Russians are insisting on, which require Western customers of Russian gas to open ruble accounts in Gazprom Bank. They will then pay Gazprom Bank for the gas they import from Russia in euros. Gazprom Bank will then convert this money into rubles, pay the money into the corresponding accounts of these companies, the ruble accounts of these companies in Gazprom Bank, with the rubles then being forwarded to Moscow. And by the way, I've also read elsewhere in the British media, this is in The Guardian this time, that Russia's earnings from its oil and gas revenues have doubled in the first quarter of this year. Even though volumes have fallen because of higher prices, the actual money Russia is receiving is increasing. And by the way, it's perhaps important to add that more money flowing to Moscow doesn't just mean more money in Russian hands. It means, because of the sanctions, that more of this money stays in Russia, becomes converted into rubles, strengthens the Russian currency there. I say that because the paradoxical effect of Western sanctions means that the Russians are no longer able to pay their sovereign debts, their debts when they fall due, in dollars and euros. So they pay in rubles. But of course, if Western creditors refuse to accept those payments, it in effect means that the Russians don't have to drain their foreign currency reserves to pay in dollars or rubles, dollars or euros anymore. And the other paradoxical effect is that the mass withdrawal of companies, Western companies from Russia, and the frenetic action that was taken in the first few weeks of this crisis to stop exports of Western products to Russia means again that the Russians don't have to pay for these products in dollars or euros either. They don't have to pay for them at all because of course they're not coming, which is increasing, it's causing the Russian current account surplus to increase further still. Russia, as a matter of fact, is currently running record current account surpluses, record budget surpluses. It is awash with money, more money at the moment than it is able to spend. It's an extraordinary outcome to the sanctions policies that the Western governments have pursued and is indicative of how poorly thought out these policies actually have turned out to be. So we find ourselves in now a very extraordinary situation with gas for rubles. And I'm going to make a further observation here. I think this is going to be a lasting arrangement. I'm reading increasing numbers of reports from various industry specialists, all of whom are saying that all EU targets or plans to diversify from Russian energy, be it oil or gas, and even coal, are unrealistic and unachievable, certainly within the timeframes that the Europeans are talking about, and that, in fact, the high probability is that oil and gas volumes will continue at roughly the current existing levels for at least a few more years, causing Russian surpluses to grow even further, even as the Russians diversify their exports further eastward. So there we go. It's been an astonishing set of actions, one which is causing massive disruption to the European economies and by extension, by the way, to the Western economies, one which is causing disruptions in Russia as the Russians have to scramble to find alternative suppliers for some of the goods that they imported from the Europeans and the United States, some of which, of course, the Russians will develop domestically. Others they will find, no doubt, in China and India and in other Asian countries. But anyway, the fact is it's caused disruptions in Russia. It's causing chaos in Europe and in the West. And that chaos seems to me to be likely to grow. Let's just consider, for example, the position of Poland, which is, and indeed of Finland. Finland imports, by the way, 100% of its gas from Russia, yet it is refusing to comply with the gas for rubles scheme. I wonder how long that can be sustained. Because the alternative is that countries like Finland, Poland, the Baltic states will have to import at least some of their gas from other European states. The Baltic states claim that they can make up for Russian pipeline gas by importing liquefied natural gas from the United States. Perhaps they can to some extent. They're relatively small, but whether they'll be able to, whether they'll be able to afford the bills is of course another matter. But Poland and Finland, I think, are going to struggle. Poland is in a better position because it's diversified its gas imports over several years. But even Poland imports large volumes of gas, pipeline gas, from Russia. And of course, Finland doesn't have facilities for the time being to import LNG. So what do the Poles and the Finns do? Well, the answer is they have to buy their gas from other European suppliers. And where will those European suppliers get their gas from? Well, predominantly, overwhelmingly from Russia. So Poland and Finland may be saying that they're not importing Russian gas, but of course they are going to be importing Russian gas. They're going to be importing it from European middlemen. And of course, in any arrangement which involves middlemen, that inevitably means that the prices are going to be even higher than they would otherwise have been. Moreover, the contracts, the energy supply contracts, the gas supply contracts between Gazprom and its European customers are, I presume, for specific volumes of gas. Obviously, the contracts allow for increases, but one wonders to what extent the Russians will comply with proposals to increase imports of gas into, say, Germany, so as to enable Germany to re-export gas to, say, Finland or Poland. And how exactly do you, by the way, send gas to Finland? I mean, I've looked at the pipeline structure. It can be done. I suspect it's going to be rather complicated. But anyway, putting all that aside, that seems to be the plan. Now, what if the Russians say no? What if the Russians say no? We're not prepared to provide you with extra gas so that you can supply that gas to Poland and Finland. And maybe at that point the Germans will say to themselves, why should we anyway go along with this complicated arrangement? Why should we drain ourselves of gas, putting pressure on German consumers so that the Poles and the Finns can pose as taking strong lines against Moscow? I can very easily see arguments and recriminations and quarrels taking place behind the scenes with the Poles and perhaps the Finns accusing the Germans and the others of crumbling in face of Russian diktat, and the Germans and the others in turn accusing the Poles and the Finns of high riding on the Germans. And I wonder whether at some point the pressure isn't going to start to grow on the Poles and the Finns to reverse their policies and to start paying for their gas in rubles through this complicated mechanism which the Russians have set up, which, after all, the others are doing, and which the Poles and the Finns would also be required to do. What about all the stories and rumours about finding ways of buying gas from other sources? Well, a lot of countries look to Algeria. Mario Draghi went there recently. He came away claiming that he'd made some kind of big deal with the Algerians. The Algerians have now said that if countries that they export gas to, like Spain, start to forward some of that gas to third parties, like presumably, ultimately, Poland and Finland, well, Algeria will have to reduce gas flows because that is outside contract and that would create problems for Algeria. I suspect Qatar will take the same line. Qatar's supplies of gas, of course, come in the form of LNG. And there are no LNG facilities in Europe for the moment capable of handling more supplies from Qatar. Moreover, I've recently read a long article about the potential for LNG exports from the United States. And without going into details, it suggested that many of the programs, the projects to build more LNG capacity in the United States is simply unrealistic, and that LNG supplies from the United States will probably rise some more, but will not come at any point close to meeting the volumes that the Europeans import from the Russians. So it seems to me that at the moment, as things stand, what has happened is that the Russians are winning this poker game, and they're winning it conclusively, and the chances are that this will be a win that they can pocket, and which will continue to provide them with all kinds of benefits for many years. Now, I also read a very interesting email sent to me by a viewer. I'm not disclosing this person's name because this was a private email. But this person made a very, very interesting point to me, which is that the fact that the Europeans have had to agree to this mechanism, or are coming round to agreeing to this mechanism, of paying for their gas to Gazprom, a Gazprom bank in euros, with the Russians, with Gazprom bank then converting the euros that they receive into roubles, actually gives the Russians something else. It gives them power to dictate the conversion rate from the euro to from the euro to the ruble. In other words, it enables the Russians to set within certain parameters or within certain limits the value of the ruble against the euro. Now, bear in mind that the euro has been declining in recent months against the dollar and indeed the ruble. We could see more of this, and it means that the entire terms of trade between the Russians and the Europeans are now shifting, with the Russians in a much stronger position to determine the price, and not just the price of gas, but the price of imports from the EU, the price of exports from Russia. The Russians could, in theory, manipulate the conversion rate to increase their revenues, their ruble revenues, even further, or to lower or to increase prices in the EU even further as it suits them. It's quite an extraordinary fact. I can't fault this viewer's analysis. It seems to me that this person has got it exactly right. Whether the Russians are thinking that far ahead, whether they're going to do something like that, I don't know. But it goes further still, because of course if the Russians have been so successful in getting Europeans to pay for gas, Russian gas, in rubles, because that's, despite the complexity of this mechanism, what it effectively amounts to. Why shouldn't they do that with other products, and not just products that they sell to Europe? Why not do it for oil? Why not do it for metals? Why not do it for everything? Now, that's going to be a long story. It's going to take a long time to unfold, but it does seem to me as if this summer, or rather this spring, a major step has been taken towards the internationalization of the ruble, towards the conversion of the ruble into a hard currency. And that may not be something that the Europeans expected, and I can say with absolute confidence it's not something that the Biden administration expected or wanted either. Now, it's important to say that we are in a complex game of chess. There's still lots going on, or rather poker rather than chess. We'll see what happens over the next few weeks. It could be that something happens that will completely upend this game. But at the moment, it does seem increasingly as if the Russians are winning. Anyway, we have had more news on other fronts. Firstly, the Germans have discovered that their decision to seize the German subsidiary of Gazprom is turning sour for them. The Russians are refusing payments from this entity, even when those payments are made in rubles. And one wonders again what the Germans are going to do about that, and whether in fact they are going to have to come to terms with Gazprom about the terms of the seizure of this asset. But perhaps more important still is a series of further warnings that was made by Putin during a meeting with legislators, senior legislators from Russia in St. Petersburg. Here I'm just going to make one little historical observation. Those who have followed the various historical pieces that my colleague Alex Christoforou and I made about the Russian Revolution on our Duran channel will may be aware that Russia had a parliament, the Duma, as it does today, in the run-up to the revolution. What I obviously didn't have time to mention is that the Duma met in a particular building. The Tsarist Duma met in a particular building in St. Petersburg, the Tavrichevsky Palace. Tavrichevsky refers to Tavrida, the region in the southern Russian Empire, as it then was, consisting of Crimea and what is now Kherson region and other places. Anyway, the Tavrichevsky Palace in St. Petersburg, that has been preserved, and in fact this meeting of legislators took place there with Putin speaking from the speaker's platform, where former Tsarist dignitaries, and by the way, Nicholas II would once have stood. Anyway, putting that little historical detail to one side, a number of things immediately stood out for me. Firstly, Putin again seemed to be very confident that things in terms of the military operation were going Russia's way in Ukraine. I'll come to that in a moment. I'm sure he is right. He also seemed reasonably confident about the position of the economy. In fact, he was talking about economic stabilization again, and we've had some economic numbers from Russia which suggest that the economy actually grew in the first quarter. That's January, February, March. I don't think one should place too much weight on that, because the real effect of the sanctions on Russia will start to appear in the second and third quarters. But anyway, for what it's worth, Russian economy actually grew in January, February and March. And March did actually show overall growth, overall GDP growth. But as I said, I think that's a figure we should not take too seriously. But perhaps the most important thing was that Putin again repeated his warning, a warning which the Russians gave right at the start of operations, which is that if the Western powers start to intervene directly in the Ukraine war, if, in other words, Western military personnel start to engage directly in this war, the Russians will respond, and they will respond in ways that Putin did not spell out, but which he seemed to imply would be completely devastating. And obviously those military personnel from NATO would then be targeted directly. So that was a very strong warning, and I do wonder why he felt the need to give that warning. I suspect Putin has been looking at various comments that have been appearing in Western governments. He's also perhaps sensing that the Western powers are starting to become increasingly alarmed about military developments in Ukraine, about Russian advances there. I'll come to that in a moment again. And I think that he felt that he needed to repeat this warning just in case anybody in the West was tempted to do some reckless thing in order to avert some sort of Ukrainian defeat. Anyway, it was an ominous warning, and I have to say, the one consistent fact about this Ukrainian crisis, both in military terms, in economic terms, with gas for Roubles, and all of these things, is that it ought to be clear by now that Putin doesn't bluff. It's not his nature. When he gives warnings like this, they are intended to be taken seriously, and Western governments should finally start heeding those warnings. Now, turning to the situation in Ukraine, we've now had another desperate statement from the commander of the Ukrainian forces trapped in the Azovstal steelworks. Now, I'm taking this from the Daily Telegraph rather than from a Russian source, so people who are skeptical of Russian sources should be aware that this comes from a British source. But I'm going to just quote the words of the Ukrainian commander of the forces in Azovstal. He is called Sergei Folina. He is described in the media, in the Western media, as the acting commander of Ukraine's 36th Marine Brigade. I've heard elsewhere that he's actually an Azov battalion officer, but it's conceivable that he is also acting simultaneously as commander of what is left of the 36th Marine Brigade, which had been the main Ukrainian force defending Mariupol. The Western media doesn't like, as a general rule, to refer much to the Azov battalion and its role in defending Mariupol. Anyway, this is what the Daily Telegraph says. He says that Commander Volina said, "In our military group, we have more than 600 injured guys with different levels of injuries. It is very difficult to administer medical assistance to them here. There is neither the conditions or the medications, and no personnel who can help them. We have civilians who are injured to whom we administer assistance as we can. Here with us are civilians, hundreds of them. There are dozens of children. There are many people with limited physical abilities, elderly people. The situation is very difficult. There is a big problem with water, food, other supplies. Save the Mariupol garrison. Provide us with the extraction procedure. Today is not 1940, it is 2022. People here will simply die. The injured will die." By the way, I don't understand what the reference to 1940 is intended to mean, but we'll come to that later. "Those who are alive now will be killed in the battle. The city has almost been wiped off the planet." Now, all I will say is that Commander Volina, and there are photographs of him, he now looks exhausted. He's got a massive beard, so he's presumably not shaving. He's presumably not washing either. If this situation in the Azovstal works is as bad as he says, and I have no reason to think it's otherwise, then he needs to do the only thing which a commander of troops in his position should do, which is to agree terms of surrender for the Russians. It is completely wrong to keep 600 people who are injured in these deplorable conditions. And it is also completely wrong to leave women and children in these conditions as well, assuming, of course, that they are indeed actually there. So he's got to come to some kind of decision about what to do. Now, the Russians have been saying over the last couple of hours that if there are any civilians, they're prepared to work with the United Nations Secretariat to have the civilians, including the women and children, leave the Azovstal factory, but that the troops there must lay down their arms and surrender. Now, I think that is a reasonable position. I would have thought that Mr. Volina, or Commander Volina, whatever his rank is, ought to do it. There is absolutely no point in prolonging this suffering. And he needs to understand that the extraction that he talks about, whatever that means exactly, simply isn't going to happen. There's not going to be a Western advance on Mariupol. Zelensky has ruled out any possibility of Ukraine by itself relieving the troops in Mariupol, breaking the siege of Azovstal. In fact, that is a ridiculous idea. And Commander Volina needs to start facing these sort of realities. Now, whether he will or not, I don't know. But my own guess, and I really do make this guess, is that sooner or later, even a committed commander like him is going to have to face these realities. And before long, we are going to see a mass surrender of the Ukrainian troops in the Azovstal. And hopefully, we will also start to see action taken to evacuate these civilians from there. I say that, I'm assuming that there are civilians in Azovstal. The Russians are not by any means absolutely sure of this, but I'm going to act on the assumption that there are indeed civilians there. Now, elsewhere, we're getting trickles of news from the Donbass fronts. All of them speak of advances by the Russians and their allied forces from the militia of the Donbass republics. And there are growing reports of very, very heavy Ukrainian losses and of the Ukrainian defense lines under this relentless pressure that they're now beginning to crack. And that might explain a comment by the British Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, in which he talked about how Putin, they always personalize everything about Russia around the personality of Putin, is acting like a cancer, embedding himself in Ukraine, and presumably, like cancers do, gradually expanding to incorporate more and more of it. If that is what the British government really assesses the situation to be like, then, as I said previously, it needs to start to make some important political decisions. If, rather than expose Ukraine to this, what the British government needs to do is to join with other Western governments to try to persuade Ukraine to compromise, to accept terms for peace with Russia, even if that peace is going to be so heavily loaded on Russian terms. The window to do that is still there, but it is closing. Now, over the last few hours, there have been reports that the Russians have now taken over the administration building in Kherson. They've now openly said that they're transitioning to a ruble payment system in Kherson region and Zaporozhye and in parts of Kharkiv region that they control. And the hryvnia, the Ukrainian currency, will be gradually phased out from there. Once this process is complete, there will presumably be at some point a referendum. These regions will then break away from Ukraine formally. I say that. I mean, I don't want to be, I want to be realistic about this. I cannot imagine the Russians staging referendums in places like Kherson and other places which they don't expect to win. So that's the reality. Ukraine will lose Kherson region. It will eventually lose Zaporozhye. And of course, the Russians are building up their forces around Nikolaev as well. And it's likely that the Ukrainians could eventually lose all of their Black Sea coast. Is that what the British want to see happen? Do they really want to see Ukraine weakened in this way? Well, I'm afraid if Ben Wallace shows some glimmers of understanding of reality, and I have to say his comments overall were of an extraordinarily belligerent and aggressive kind, even if he did make this admission about cancer. Liz Truss, Britain's incredibly incompetent foreign secretary showed no understanding of reality at all. She pitched the terms of victory over Russia, which is what she appeared to commit Britain to achieving, as the total liberation of all Ukrainian territory, including presumably Crimea and Donbass. This, even as Ukraine's position, military position, continues to crumble, and as we see an escalating inflation crisis in Western economies. Now, I'm going to make a guess. I think that Liz Truss made these comments at a speech in the Mansion House. This is a large building in central London where British ministers are regularly hosted by the worthies of the City of London. That's the financial community, the British financial community. Anyway, I suspect that Liz Truss made these comments because she's sensing that the writing is on the wall for Boris Johnson, and she's making a pitch to succeed him as British Prime Minister. And she wants to do that by doing the same thing that she did some months ago when she visited Moscow, pitching herself as the new Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady, the person who was going to take on the Russian bear and defeat the Russian bear. In reality, Margaret Thatcher did no such thing. She did make some very, very strong comments about the Soviet Union. She did support the Mujahideen fighters in Afghanistan. But as anybody who remembers what Margaret Thatcher actually did whilst Prime Minister will confirm, in fact, through most of her premiership, she actually sought and eventually achieved a significant improvement in relations with Moscow. And of course, with Mikhail Gorbachev, she eventually achieved an extraordinary understanding, of which, by the way, many Russians are very critical of in Russia itself. But that's another story. Anyway, Liz Truss is adopting the myth of Margaret Thatcher as she tries to present herself as the future Prime Minister to the hardliners in the British Conservative Party and government, rather than the reality of Margaret Thatcher as I remember it from the 1980s. But regardless, this is an attempt to play domestic politics with a critically important international issue. Liz Truss's comments are, to put it mildly, unhelpful. In fact, if this policy that she is demanding the Western powers follow is pursued, it will only lead to disaster. I hope still that wiser counsels will prevail, but it seems to me that with people like Liz Truss around, that is increasingly unlikely, and I have to say the more likely prospect is that Ukraine will very soon lose Kherson region and probably Zaporozhye, that Mariupol will eventually witness the surrender of the Ukrainian troops in the Azovstal factory, and that within a period of a couple of weeks at most, the remaining Ukrainian troops in Donbass will be surrounded, completely surrounded, and forced to lay down their arms as well. And then, of course, the risk is that having achieved the goals of Phase 2, if there is still no peace, the Russians will move forward to something further, to Phase 3. I'm not going to try and guess what that is, but Putin's words in the building of the former Imperial State Duma in St. Petersburg were uncompromising. They were a lot more measured than the words of Liz Truss, or indeed Ben Wallace, and I think it is those words that we should heed. I think that the longer this goes on for, the less of Ukraine there will be, and the more damage will be done to the West as well. That's where I'm going to stop for today. I Look forward to you joining me again soon. Remember, you can find us on other platforms. You can find us on Rumble. And of course, if you watch any of our videos there and you press the red maroon button at the top of the video, that will take you directly to our locals homepage, where you can become an active member, publish your own exclusive content on our homepage, comment on our threads, and join my Wednesday live streams, which happen every Wednesday on Locals exclusively at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time. And you can also, of course, find us on other platforms like the new free speech platform SuperU, ODYSEE, and many others. And also, you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop and buying the great things that you will find there, our t-shirts, our magic mugs, and all those great things. And of course, don't forget, if you've liked this video, to press the like button and also to check your subscription to this channel. Well, that's enough for me today. Thank you for joining me today on this program, on this channel. I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a very good day until then.